So it's been a while since I've made a video because I had my final exams and then I didn't really want to film, and then I was watching the Ratatouille musical on TikTok, and then I was reading a lot, and it's just been like a month, 2 months. I don't know when I last uploaded. But I've been meaning to make a video about lining the pair of 18th century stays that I made back in July. There's a video about that. I'll link that down below. And I know that I always have trouble getting around to lining stays because it's like kind of optional and it's not super fun, and I always want to move on to the next project, but I thought that I should finally get around to lining these stays, and I hope that watching me lining these stays will provide a little bit of information that might be useful for you if you want to line stays, and I hope it'll provide the encouragement that you need to if you want to line stays as well. So let's get to sewing.
Lining 18th century stays is the last step in their construction because the lining is tacked into the finished garment. Given the unusual shape of stays with all of the tabs, lining stays with one piece of fabric would be intolerably fiddly, so instead the tabs are lined individually. I cut scraps of mystery linen to be about the right shape of the tabs, folded the edges under, and used a whip stitch to apply each lining piece to each tab. The lining was specifically stitched to the linen binding of the tabs as I wished to hide the edge of the binding. The tops of the tabs were left raw because they will be covered by the lining of the body of the stays. Once the tabs were lined, I lined the body of the stays. Ordinarily, this would be done with 1 or 2 pieces of fabric cut in the shape of the stays, but I wanted to use up scraps left over from making my checked linen apron, so instead I pieced the lining. First, I laid a scrap of linen over the interior of the stays, ensuring that it covered the edges of the garment. Then I pinned it roughly in place. Next, I cut the piece of lining fabric roughly to the shape of the stays, reserving the excess for the remainder of the lining. The top and bottom edges of the lining were folded under and tacked to the binding with whip stitches. I left the sides of the lining pieces raw, as they would eventually be covered by the next lining panels. You might be wondering the purpose of such a complicated method of lining stays when the lining could just as easily be attached before binding the stays and secured with the binding. However, it is important to remember that stays, made of layers of fabric and buckram and boning and sometimes even paper and often bound in leather, could not be washed beyond spot cleaning. Stays are worn close to the body, often separated from the skin only by a thin linen shift, so tacking in a lining after binding made the lining easy to remove and wash or dispose of if the stays got dirty or sweaty. Ripping out the lining and replacing it, therefore, was a better option than risking damaging the stays by soaking them in the water and soap and lye or stale urine used in 18th century laundry practices. Anyway, back to lining. After the center of the stays was lined, I used a similar technique to pin in place and cut a scrap so that it would serve as the next piece of lining. I folded under the top, bottom, and side of this piece of the lining so that it covered the raw edge of the lining piece it abutted. Essentially, with this process of lining, my goal was to prevent the exposure of raw edges while doing as little extra stitching as possible, and overall it worked pretty well. With that, the stays were lined. Overall, this isn't a difficult process, nor is it particularly time-consuming, and I hope it will serve to protect my stays and keep them fresher and sturdier for a longer time. Let me know in the comments if you've ever put off lining stays, and please feel free to ask any questions. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.